Good morning. My name is Bob Bear. I bring you greetings from Emmanuel Mennonite Church, where I am currently the transitional pastor. And it still feels awkward speaking to a computer, knowing that this is sort of meant to be an audience that is about connecting with each other. It's what church is sort of meant to be. I do want to thank Darnell for reaching out to me and allowing me to share today's message. I know that Yarrow Mennonite is sitting in Eastertide, sitting in that story of Jesus between the resurrection and Pentecost. And not to think too far ahead and starting a new series, but to actually recognize that this is the time where Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, walked on this earth. Not to be rushing into the next big topic. But I also appreciate that Darnell gave me the grace to use Emmanuel's theme for my own sanity and not have to prepare two different messages. At Emmanuel, we are just about to start a new series after Easter called Rediscovering Community, and we are looking at it from the book of Acts, although I think it could be easily called Rediscovering the Holy Spirit in the early church community. Our topic and Yarrow's topic cover the same timeline, but they cover it from different angles. Unlike the verses at the end of Matthew, Luke, and John, which are designated and designed to be the end of a particular chapter in history, the chapter of Jesus' life here on earth, the verses that were read today from Acts 1 are designed to be the beginning of the next chapter. The end of the Gospels takes time to celebrate Jesus raised from the dead, and the beginning of Acts prepares us for what comes next. The one thing that you should probably know about the way I read the Bible is that God needs to remain the main character. Many translations call this book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles. As it follows Peter, John, James, Stephen, Paul, and the new believers of the early church as they try to be the people of God and spread the good news and do the good work that they have been called and that we have been called to do. We may also call this the story of the early church. The problem that I often find, though, is that when we make individuals in the Bible the main character, we tend to make Jesus or God the afterthought. In the case of the book of Acts, we make the Holy Spirit the afterthought, and we put Paul as the central character or Peter as the central character. We define church then by the people that started it, or we define our own church by those people in the pews or the people in leadership. We define our purpose and our direction by our personal preferences and our personal insights. So I actually prefer the title, which some people use, Acts of the Holy Spirit, or as one commentator called it, the ongoing acts of Jesus Christ. And I love the way that Luke starts this book. In my former book, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until he was taken up to heaven, as if there is more to the story, because Jesus remains the main character. So now that's out of the way. The book of Acts follows this plot line of the growth of God's new community, the church, after Jesus ascended. Luke begins this book by laying out the foundations that God's community is built upon, the proof of Jesus' resurrection, the promise that Jesus' presence will be with them in the form of the Holy Spirit, and the patience and prayer that they need to practice in order to be prepared for God to move first in their own neighborhood and eventually into the whole world. I told Darnell that I don't usually give messages with alliterations because it's too much of a tongue twister, but this is what you get today. So proof. The first thing Luke brings to mind is the proof of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Acts 1 verse 3 states that Jesus presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. Wouldn't you think that Jesus just showing up and showing himself to the disciples would have been proof enough? As we sit in the stories between Resurrection Sunday and Ascension Day and Pentecost, Jesus not only shows up, but he proves that it is really him and that he is really alive. At the empty tomb, Jesus calls Mary by name. He knows her. On the road to Emmaus, he walks with the two disciples. He teaches them and breaks bread with them. In the upper room, when he presents himself to the disciples, they think he's a ghost, but he asks for food because he's hungry, and a ghost just doesn't do that. A week later, Thomas needs to put his fingers into the holes where the nails had left, and put his hands into the hole where the spear was thrust into his side. At Galilee, he made a fire. He cooked breakfast. He ate with his disciples. Even in Acts 1:4, which was read, it says that while he was eating with them, he gave them a command. And the command we will look at in just a little bit. And sometimes I wonder, why would it be so important to prove that he is alive? And then I think of times that I have been certain that I have encountered Jesus, where God's guidance was unmistakable, and I knew that his presence was real. And then within a few weeks or months of that encounter, I question it all completely. I remember the first time that I was called to be youth pastor at my home church in Surrey. And I was around 35, a little too old to start being a youth pastor. And I had my list of excuses why it shouldn't be me. And I told Jesus in prayer and others that I didn't want to be a pastor as a single person. I needed that support at home. My job at the time was wholly dependent on me and my specific skill set and knowledge. If I left, the company actually may not survive. The position at the time was not financially viable in my home church. And I had a whole list of other excuses, so I passed. 3 years later, they asked again, and I passed again. A year later, they asked again, and I passed again. Then, at the age of 40, I got married. I created space in the company so I was not as indispensable. And every other excuse that I ever had on my list had been all erased. And my wife Shannon and I sensed that God was doing something. There was an uneasiness at where we were. But we weren't sure what it was, because there was no longer a calling to the church, because that space had been filled by someone else. And I remember telling a good friend at work about it, and they looked at me and shook their finger at me, and they said, God is calling you to something. And when he calls, you better follow. 2 days later, my pastor called and asked if we could go for coffee. And at coffee, he said that the youth pastor position was coming up again, and I was on the top of everyone's list. Would I apply? How could we deny God's presence in those circumstances? How could we deny God's calling, God's real reality in our lives? But 2 or 3 weeks later, were we just imagining all of those things? Was it just a sense of coincidences? Are we sure that God is in this? It's amazing how quickly doubt can creep in to things that we're not sure about. When Jesus ascended into heaven, there was no doubt in the minds of the disciples as they stood on the proof that Jesus demonstrated to them on those 40 days. They knew with all of their hearts, with all of their minds, with all of their soul, with all of their strength that Jesus was alive. It was the first basis for Christian community. It was not centered on, it if it is not centered and grounded on the reality of Jesus being raised from the dead, then all that we do is in vain. We are not God's community. We are just a bunch of people singing songs together and hopefully being good to the neighbors around us. Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 17. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. My faith is futile. So proof was the first foundation, but it was not the last. The disciples had 3 years of training with Jesus. They now had undeniable proof that he had been raised from the dead, but they were not yet ready for being God's community. They needed the presence of the Holy Spirit. So when Jesus commanded, this is what he said, "Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift of my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit." If they could have been God's community based only on what Jesus taught and belief that he had been raised from the dead, then they should have been set. But without Christ as an ever-present head of the church, it's just a bunch of good-willed people gathering together. Without the Holy Spirit as the main character in our Christian community, then what separates us from the rest of the world? So what does the Holy Spirit bring to Christian community? The Bible talks about guidance in our direction, empowerment in our actions, remembering the teachings of Jesus when we need them the most, the words on our lips when we don't know exactly how to explain things and when we are lost, deep prayers when we can't seem to express ourselves, unity when we can't seem to get along, revelation when we seem lost, comfort when we feel inadequate, counsel when we are full of questions, and assurance when we are just not sure. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is what the presence of the Holy Spirit brings to community. That is why we need him as a foundation for who we are moving forward. And that is one special gift that the Father gives us. And if the Holy Spirit is not present in our community, then we're just trying to do all of those things on our own. Jesus taught his disciples that he needed to return to the Father in order for the gift of the Holy Spirit to come down. Acts says it was 40 days after his resurrection that he ascended and returned to his Father. This year we commemorate Ascension Day on May 13th. But even with Jesus' ascension, the first church still had not formed. It would be 10 more days before the Holy Spirit would descend upon the upper room at Pentecost. And this was a time of preparation and patience in waiting on the Holy Spirit. And I'm curious what the mindset of the disciples were at this time. Were there some that were full of anticipation, curiosity, what that looks like, fear of what that looks like, excitement for what that looks like, or just a simple sense of the unknown? I imagine myself waiting for the Holy Spirit, not fully knowing what we are waiting for. So they spent time in prayer. They were patient and they waited on the Holy Spirit to come on them, whatever that meant and whatever that looked like, and I guess wherever that directed them. And when the Holy Spirit did come down into the world changed forever. The community of believers were created, and though not always perfect, this was the beginning. Our current community is meant to be a reflection of that first church built upon the foundations that are found in this first chapter of Acts. A community based on the proof that Jesus was raised from the dead and witnessed by the disciples, as well as Jesus' presence in our own life that we witness. a community based on the presence of the Holy Spirit in our midst, of relying on His Spirit for guidance, empowerment, teaching, counseling, and so much more. A community based on patience, prayer, and preparedness to move in step with the Holy Spirit into the world around us, first outside of our doors and potentially to the whole rest of the world. Not to move too quickly, not to move too slowly. And as we sit in this time between Easter and Pentecost, may we be a community that celebrates all Jesus did at Easter, and also be the community Jesus is calling us to based on the foundations of Jesus and the Holy Spirit as our main character, based on Acts chapter 1. God's blessing to Yarrow Church.